So how is everybody? Hanging in there still? Yeah? We have Larry Ryan in the audience here today. Larry Ryan is also a member of our Horticultural Sciences Advisory Board. Hi, Larry. Now, I'm sure you know Larry. Larry is the CEO of Ryan Lawn and Tree. I think one of the biggest landscaping companies here, I think. I would say next to Hermes, I would say, maybe on the same par, yeah? So Larry Ryan Larry has been serving on our advisory board since before I came. So, yeah, and Larry would have qualified for the Workforce Education Employer Initiative Award from KBOR, but Larry did not submit his paperwork on time. You see? I sent him 2 reminders. So next year, he's going to get the award, right? Larry is very busy, though. He just acquired another company, so that's why he didn't put in the paperwork. So next year, Larry, yeah? And I also have in the audience Dr. B.B. Kronwall from UMKC. When I was at UMKC, I reported, she actually recruited me. She convinced me that UMKC was better than KU, because I had already started at KU, and she said, no, UMKC is for you. You're coming here. So I did. So I was a lecturer at UMKC in cell biology and biophysics with Dr. B.B. Kronwall. So she's here in the audience here today. Welcome, B.B. All right. Now, I do not want to disappoint you, but our speaker from Colombia, he's stuck somewhere on an icy road. So he just emailed me and said he will not be able to make it here on time. But I do have something else for you, another treat for you. We have Paul Sammett from Canada. He came from, he came all the way from Ontario, Canada last night. So he's going to give a special talk today on container planting. How does that sound? So a big thank you to Paul here for offering to do another talk on container planting. Yeah. So Paul actually is a graduate from the University of Guelph, and that's where I did my master's and PhD as well. And if you did not know Guelph is in Ontario, Canada, beautiful town, next to Kitchener, Waterloo, London, very beautiful town. So Paul is a graduate of the University of Guelph, and he's a Nancy Eaton Director of Horticulture at the Toronto Botanical Garden. Formerly, he was employed at a large Toronto garden center where he was a perennial department manager for almost 2 decades. He's a regular speaker at garden clubs and horticultural trade shows across Canada and the United States. And in recent years, Paul has presented in Germany, Switzerland, and Bermuda. He has appeared both on television and in print in October of 2014, Paul led a 10-day garden and food tour on the island of Sicily. And that's where I'm going to go next year. Paul and his wife's home garden has been featured in Canadian Living, Gardening Life, Canadian Gardening, and Gardening How To. Their personal garden was awarded first place in the environmental garden category in the 2001 City of Toronto Garden Contest, followed by an award in 2003 for the best use of plant material in the City of Toronto West District Garden Contest. Paul's container designs have also been showcased several times in assorted gardening magazines, most recently on the cover of the 2012 special design issue of Garden Making. In 2008, he won first place in the Scott's Miracle Grow Do Up the Doorstep competition for the container entry in Canada Blooms. That's a huge workshop as well. Paul has been awarded the Young Professionals Award by the Perennial Plant Association, and in 2010, he was a recipient of an Industry Service Award as well. Today, Paul is going to discuss, so his first talk is going to be on container gardening. Thank you, Paul. We really appreciate you doing this for us.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here and to get to step in. Now, I too will start with a little bit of a confession, just like Dennis. But my confession is I was very fortunate many, many years ago. My parents are blue-collar workers. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And I remember them telling me very early on, find a job that you love. And I think I have done that. I discovered that. I found a career in horticulture. And what I will tell you is I hope that some of you will find the same pleasure, the same therapy, the same exercise, the same relief that I have found in horticulture. I do apologize also to the poor cameraman. If you're trying to capture me on that film, you are in trouble. I do not stand still. I've gone to therapy, gone to counseling. It has not worked because I love what I do. So last minute preparation, we're going to do a presentation on container gardening. So bear with me, and here we go. Container gardening, it is everywhere. It is absolutely everywhere. There are still some discussions of it being a trend. It is not a trend, it is a mainstay. It is here to stay, and it is an opportunity for many of you. We have seen it throughout Canada. I've traveled through the US and into Europe. It is here to stay. And again, an opportunity, I want to explore that with you. What containers allow us to do is they allow us to bring in plant material into all sorts of spaces, to give people no excuses to not garden. In Toronto, which is said to be a very green city, and I don't necessarily agree. I think we're a very concrete city. A lot of emphasis in landscapes is on hardscaping, which is important, but a lot of hardscaping. We bring the plant material back through the use of our containers. So please keep that in mind. In spaces like this where you wouldn't want to walk down, you can't grow anything. We do not give up that space, ladies and gentlemen. We utilize this space. And this is actually a little coffee shop, and they have a little bakery on the side, or a little restaurant, and they harvest from here and on the roof to provide some fresh ingredients. And in my own garden, and I'm not sure about you, but isn't it funny how we run out of space in our gardens? My back is full, my front is full. So now I utilize every square inch, and between our house and our neighbor's house is 12 feet of solid concrete. Do you think I'm going to give up that space? No. I grow a lot of perennials in containers, and this is just a view as you enter into our backyard. I spent almost 20 years working at the retail level, and as I was going to leave the garden center, I could see in my clients who were downsizing, giving up their gardens to move into condominiums. You know, and there was that withdrawal. They were scared because the garden was their salvation. And we remind these people that even in places like this, you can have wonderful gardens. These are rooftops with abundant supply of plant material. Let's garden to the heavens, my friends. Let's show them that they can do that. Let us also remember the power of gardening and containers and horticulture in general. We heard some discussions about this earlier. The power to connect with people, the horticultural therapy. I give you an example. My parents have been married 51 years. I know my parents love each other dearly, but there are times you question that, as my mother, tries to find more hobbies for my father. And the garden is her escape. It's her sanctuary. It is where she is able to challenge her arthritis by keeping her hands moving. And as she says, Paul, it's easy to get down on the ground. I just can't get up anymore. So we use containers to bring the garden to her. Keep giving her that. Horticultural therapy is a whole movement in itself. And yes, these people may be planting a geranium. A geranium. Most horticulturists often turn their nose up at geraniums, and that's a shame. But the power of this, to be able to rub the leaf, to feel the soil, to do the good. And I hope you experience some of that as well. Now, I would also like to say, you may see some typos in this in terms of the word color. We in Canada spell the word different from yourselves. I did not have the opportunity to fix that as I ran up here to do this presentation. But I hope you here, just as we do in Canada, remind individuals that we have distinct seasons. We have 4 seasons, and we should celebrate those seasons. Horticulture, the garden centers, don't shrivel up and go away in the winter. And if they do, you're making a very big mistake. Okay, learn to utilize this through containers. Containers should reflect the magic of spring, the glory of summer, and sometimes this is the only time people think of their containers. And what a shame. The glory of fall. I love fall because you can accessorize, you can do all sorts of things. Lots of drama. But I certainly hope that, here you're discovering, I heard research about pumpkins and gourds. I often travel 2 hours just to find unusual pumpkins and gourds. I realize it's not the most environmental, but it is an addiction, I will confess. But I certainly hope that you do not have the same problem here. We're encouraging people to redo their containers, and this is how they do them. This is not it. This is not it. I feel like going to their houses and knocking on their door saying, I'm sorry, you're not done. Come on out here. Take a little bit of these leaves and maybe decoupage them. And worse off, they leave them. Containers allow you to change with the seasons. Winter arrangements are the funnest and greatest of all. And let us discover this. So when we talk about the container, what is the container? It's something that's going to support the plant material. And I remind you, for those of us who do landscape, we teach people to invest in the hardscape or beautiful specimens. Teach them to invest in the container. A container is something that can and should be left out all year long, and it is a piece of artwork, beautiful to look at. Okay, now granted, this container here is not in my own garden. I wish I could afford it. It probably costs more than the CRV that I drive. But teach people to invest in beautiful containers, and I'm going to hopefully show you some of them. Now, I personally have no issue with swans, but I do have issue with landfill. And I see a lot of containers made of plastic or resin that become very, very brittle. Oh, but they're economical, Paul, but they end up as landfill. And I have issue with that. Same thing like I see resin patio furniture. 17 years ago, I remember my wife and I discussing, we were going to buy aluminum furniture. And it was expensive. We have 2 boys. It was an investment. But my friends, that aluminum furniture is still outside. And our neighbors, who are very dear people, have 4 children. They have put out 2, if not 3, patio sets of this plastic furniture out to the curb that has ended up in the landfill. So let us invest in things that we can keep. Let us remember the container is a source of color. I don't know about you, but sometimes I do a lot of consultation on gardens, and people often ask for shaded locations. And in those locations where you go to stick the shovel in the ground and it comes right back at you, because nothing is going to grow there. There's either a tree or something, and it's brutal, hard conditions. Well, use the container. Garden above the ground. Stop fighting it. And I've got all sorts of tips and tricks on that, but I need to move on. Another example here in our home garden. The back is quite shaded, and in this case here, what we're able to do is bring color into the shaded garden by using the container. I also ask you to please keep in mind in this case here, notice we're using things like the caladium to color echo, which is a very, very important point when you're thinking about designing with containers. We echo that further with things like the furniture, and I'm not a fan of things painted white. Both of these things are very, very old vintage pieces, and that's the way they came. I'm going to let them patina. And then in this case here, echo on things like the silver birch and its bark, connecting things together. Regardless of the size, whether it's a 2-inch container or a great big monster one. I want you to have nightmare points about this next point because it's still a problem, a very serious problem. Regardless of what the container or so-called container is made out of, it must have drainage holes. I have still seen in some American publications, and Canadian ones too, this old question. If I don't have drainage holes, what do I do? Put a layer of gravel on the bottom. Can you believe it? Spending 20 years at the garden center, I saw more plants die by being put into so-called containers without drainage holes. These are not 3 containers you see here. This is not a container, my friends. It is a pot cover. So be aware of that. It sounds like an obvious point, but I see it still happening. I'm sorry if I'm going to disturb you there. I also encourage you to be cautious of these words frost resistant. Think about where a lot of these containers come from. They never actually see a frost. Okay, so be conscious of that, where you're buying and what you're buying. And these containers with 10-year guarantees. Most suppliers are fearful of me when I go to trade shows because they know how picky I am, and I'm a little bit opinionated, which you may have guessed already. But you know what? I think we need to be truthful. And I think there's nothing wrong with saying that either you've made a mistake, it's a learning process. And my fear of being in the world of horticulture, I've been in it for over 25 years, is I'm not going to live long enough to experience everything that I want. But in this case here, when they show us these containers, guaranteed for 10 years, show me a container that's 10 years old, especially when they don't have drainage holes. You know where I'm going with that. The other very, very important point to remember is what we put into our containers. And we're going to discuss plants. If you think I'm excited now, wait till I start talking plants for you. But we're going to talk about the plants. We're talking about the container mix here. And I still see issues with people putting just straight soil, garden soil, or triple mix in containers. Very different than using garden soil in the ground and triple mix in the ground, because there's all the microbes and the biology and the worms that do all the things. In containers, it's very different. And for us, usually July, August, containers that are filled with straight soil or triple mix settle, and the roots can't breathe. Remember, the most important thing, other than remembering about drainage holes from today for this presentation, this impromptu presentation, I hope it's going okay so far, is the roots. Remember, they need to be thriving, because what happens above will not if you don't have what's happening below. So let us look forward. There are all sorts of product on the market. It is marketing. All sorts of products that you can add to your container mixes to keep them moist. And one thing I have learned, I'll be careful what I say and don't let it leave this room, is I'm not a fan of these products. Because for me, it is more important for plants to experience slightly drying out or to be slightly stressed than constantly being moist. And the challenge, and I'm going to talk to you about watering this afternoon and water conservation, in this case here, when these products take up the moisture and it continues to rain or someone's watering too much, they stay wet. Most roots of plants do not like those conditions. And I see a friend is nodding. Thank you. I'm getting some agreement right there. Are you the gentleman that didn't hand in your paperwork? No. Okay. So let us remember that containers depend on us. So when you're deciding what to use in your containers, have I done something wrong? Okay. I usually do something wrong. When we are deciding what to put into the containers, let us remember that the plants in there depend on us. So we choose it carefully based on lifestyle, and I'll talk about that later on this afternoon. But they depend on us for nutrients. And I'm a huge fan of water-soluble, organic-based fertilizers, but if you're maintaining containers for clients that you can't always get there, a slow-release fertilizer. And remember, this is not the silver bullet. And I agree with Dennis's presentation. We have confused the consumer. We're giving them what they want by saying, oh, it's so easy. Feed once, hanging basket, smart coat. Feed and forget. What happened to the experience of gardening, the therapy when you get out there? Some people aren't aware of that, and some people look at me like I'm strange. Gardening is therapy. It is my salvation. It's my escape. When we use things like irrigations and irrigation systems for our containers, and I will admit I'm not a huge fan of them, let us please keep in mind what we are irrigating. I was called out to this job. This is Kimberly Fern, not a breathtaking shot, but just about right here was a huge container of succulents, and they were wilting. People were didn't know what was going on. It's like, they were giving them water, and that was the problem. They were getting the same water as the ferns, which require more water, and the succulents were rotting. And the solution to it was simply pull the spigots out. Okay? But let's just be conscious of that. I also encourage you to collect. Horticulture is a little bit of an addiction, and I call it sometimes the Martha syndrome, having all the bowls, all the containers. And what's fun about containers is you can move and change them, particularly with the seasons. And in this case here's a series of containers. This is between our house and our neighbor's house that constantly get moved and changed around. Okay? There's either 5 or 6 containers there. And I love just to change things and move them. Now, there was mention about HGTV. I agree with you. Amen. Where has gardening gone? Occasionally, when we get a whiff or a hint of gardening, it's reality TV. And I don't know about your gardening shows, but when we see gardening, it's about reality and getting it done. They finish a garden in a weekend. My friends, I've been gardening in one garden for 17 years. I'm nowhere near being done. How do they get it done in a weekend? But containers allow that a little bit. Because look, you move in on you move in on Friday. Think about what on earth are we going to do? So you get some containers on the Saturday. On the Sunday, you've got your plants, and away you go. Okay? Now, I take offense. That is my back patio. You recognize the aluminum furniture. I do love my containers. So, from a design standpoint, let's think about how we can use containers to direct the eye, for people to direct them where they want to go or where you don't want them to go. In this case here, this was photographed in Switzerland. This is Gora, our native whirling butterfly, one of the longest perennials you can grow, needs very well-drained soils. But in this case here, these create this outdoor room, this kind of escape. It's an outdoor kitchen, which is quite fun and very dramatic. In this case here, this is in the beaches area in Toronto, very, very narrow footprints of these houses. They're very long, but very narrow. So in this case here, fortunately, these two neighbors get along together, and they may have the same gardener, or hopefully they garden together. But look what they've done here. They're using containers and echoing plant material in the landscape to pick up on the containers and to combine both properties. So that when I look at this, it's not a very tiny footprint, it's actually quite wide. I'm sorry, folks, it's very warm in here. And I need to stop. I'm going to trip over this step. I've just graduated to bifocals. Not a good part of life, I tell you. This step is going to get me, so I'm going to stay over here. So, probably don't know why I told you all of that. Moving on. Moving on. How you plant your container. There's been a lot of backlash about this, and I admit if I see one more Dracaena stuck in the middle of a planter, I'm going to scream. But I will tell you, Dracaenas are a very exciting group of plants, and they're properly called cordylines. They are not Dracaenas or spikes, and there's a lot of breakthroughs. I could talk to you for about 20 minutes just on cordylines alone. They're delicious. There's many selections out there, but I can't because I have no idea what the next slide is. Moving on. Okay. There is discussion of what you, sorry? Yes, there you go. He's got it. There is discussion about when you put things together, and there's been some backlash about this. You know, does your container have the thrillers, the fillers, and the spillers? And I did not come up with this terminology. It was Steve Silks out of the Boston area. And again, there's been backlash on the web saying, oh, please, that's not all containers are all about. But you know what? Once you hear this, it does stick in your mind, and it becomes a little bit of a design principle. And so these naysayers, or these haters, I call them, on the web page, come on, really, it's gardening after all. But when I do containers, my friend, this is what I look for. I look for height. Where is the container going to go? How is it going to be viewed? What are people going to see? Do we have drama? You may have guessed it. I like a little bit of drama. In this case here, using things like the phormiums. Do we have fragrance? In this case here, using things like rosemary. Fragrance is a very, very powerful emotion. And for me, when I smell rosemary, it's very therapeutic because it reminds me back home in Malta where I was born. And we grow rosemary in the streets, and I have very fond memories of my grandmother and I picking up rosemary from the streets. Do we have color? Darn it all, we had to add some flowers. I am the director of horticulture at the Toronto Botanical Garden, and I'm the first to say I love flowers, but I truly think they are overrated. My passion is foliage, so I'm getting that out. That was a therapy session. Then there's also texture. I love texture. In this case here, using things like thyme, and that buzzword again, color echoing. The importance of having color echoing to pick up on things like the formula. And please keep in mind, this container is done all the way around, so there's color happening there. So to me, what is a container design? A container design is just like a beautiful garden. Gardens are made out of beautiful trees, shrubs, perennials, annuals, mixed all together. And I say do that in containers as well. Bring it together. So I give you an example as we move to spring. This was a container design I did for a magazine, and the person, the editor, was a friend of mine, and she likes to kind of rib me a little bit. And she said, I want something very, very formal. I said, and you called me. I don't do formal. I don't know how. I admit, I don't know how. And so she sent me these containers. I mean, look at these lines. Straight lines. So she sends me 3 of them, and I thought, okay, she's really pushing me. And then she says, Paul, we want to shoot them in your garden. Disaster. There's nothing formal about my garden. So I did what I could. And this is the design. In our home garden, note the slight elevations of them, slightly on an angle. Okay, and what I remind you is when we design a container, think about the surrounding landscape. Think about the trim. All of these factors are very, very important because we want the container either to sharply contrast that or to echo it. And in this case here, there's things like the Japanese maple in the background to pick up on the burgundy. There's hints of blue here from the muscari, which would then get taken out of the container and reused in the garden, upcycling, reusing plant material, picking up on the mertensia, which you can barely see in the background out of focus, the Virginia bluebell, so it echoes with that, and we go on that way. Also in this case here, note where I said I was being formal with echoing, is see these lines? Echoing on the birch. Okay? That was the best I could do. The best I could do. So when you design a spring container, ideally, when we talk about garden centers, we want people to pull everything out and buy everything new. Well, reality of economics really comes into play here. So what I remind individuals when you are designing containers, whether for yourself or for clients, is the importance of recycling material or use material so that when you have to change it, you don't have to change the whole thing. If you've got 30 clients you need to do that week, do you have time to replace the whole container? I wish we had that much time. So I like to incorporate things like boxwood, evergreens that allow me to go from season to season. I'm a big fan of using Hydra helix, English ivy, and yes, I use English ivy. For us in Canada, it is now on the invasive species list because it has gotten into our ravines. It is pulling down trees. And I remind people, let us have the discussion. Am I a bad person because I'm using English ivy in a container? It's where the plant is. Let us be aware of that, and I'd love to discuss that further. So in this case here, I do like vintage things, taking this container here. I love brown in the garden. I think it's a beautiful color, and I think it's underrated, the color brown. And in this case here, using things like hellebores, frilled pansies, and heather. I'm a big fan of bringing and inviting pollinators in the garden. So when I design and use plants, I like to use plants that are going to invite those guests in the garden. Hellebores are a magnet, single hellebores, my friend. I do a whole topic on attracting pollinators to the garden, which is a topic for another day, hint, hint. But having said that, or maybe this afternoon if someone else doesn't show, but recycling the plant material. And what I love about things like the heather, once they're done blooming, they go into the garden. The hellebores. I have got tons of hellebores in my garden because I've used them in containers, and when they're finished flowering, what do? Do you throw them away? Oh, no, you don't. you know where I'm going. So in this case here, color echoing. See the silver patina here? We echo it with things like the Senecio or the Dusty Miller. Okay? Really repeating. Keep that in mind. We talked about edibles. It is a gift to horticulture that people love food, and it is engaging people back into it. My son and my daughter-in-law in Ottawa have a very small property, and the only plants they've got on there are edibles. Okay? And they're engaging with my 2 grandchildren to grow plants, which is really amazing. Now, I could talk to you all day just about different selections of lettuce. I opened a catalog, 72 different selections. I need a bigger garden. Moving on. But in this case here, using during the cool part of the season, things like chard, beets, kohlrabi that like cool conditions. You know all those containers you guys laughed at me about on that patio? You know you did. Well, what I often do in the spring is fill them and just put mescaline seed mix. Because when it's nice and cold, it just grows. And I love it. We open our home garden to raise money for women's shelters. And people will come and see the garden, and they walk around it. It's like, you know, Betty, it looks like lettuce, but what do you think it is? Honestly, come on. So I show you another example here, growing basil in containers. How many of you have grown perpetual pesto basil? Show of hands. A few. I heard that gap. Isn't it wonderful? Love it. May I borrow this for just a sec?
Sure.
Oh, hello. How are you? Okay, if you hold this, if I was holding perpetual pesto basil like this, Lekha would be able to smell it within 15 seconds at the back of the room. It is that fragrant. You just go like this. So I'm going to show you a trick. I love to mess with people's minds. So you use herbs. There it is. Okay. So in this case here, taking perpetual pesto basil, cold sensitive, incorporating in a mixed planter with annuals and tropicals and all this kind of fun stuff. But see the helichrysum here, my friends? It reaches out and has these arms. So when people walk by the container, they hit the helichrysum, and it just ricochets and causes a vibration through the planter. And what it does, it causes the perpetual pesto to shake and release a fragrance. And it's a riot to watch people, because they'll walk by, and they can smell the basil. It's like, I smell basil, but where is it? You know, and they often don't know what it is because it's variegated. And perpetual pesto, unlike traditional basil, does not go to seed, does not flower. So it remains vegetative. So here's an example if we do things quickly. How many of you have gone to the garden center just to look? Well, it's a problem of mine. You know, I go there to look, and then you come home with things. What are you going to do? That's how I discovered growing a lot of plants in containers, because I had too many. They couldn't get into the ground. So using my organic-based fertilizer and organic water-soluble fertilizer, I'm going to grow a fairly edible container, and I've got 3 perpetual pestos. I love to use parsley in containers. Is that parsley? I've pieced this together very last minute, so forgive me. And then I've put together some heucheras, which I really, really needed. Oh, boy. And then some pink and curly hydra. Okay? Just a very fragrant planter, no flowers, but to me, a lot of interest and a lot of color, and you can see the completed thing there. And functional as well. I show you one of my all-time favorite basils. This one's African blue basil. And what's fantastic about African blue basil is don't worry about pinching it. You will never keep up with it, because it is so prolific. It is edible, both the leaves and the flowers, and it is a magnet to bees. So they just love it. It's also much more cold tolerant than most of the basils. Now, you know, there is a limit with basil. You know, if the wind is too strong and it's 1 degree too cool, basil, you know, kind of sulks and looks terrible. But this is the most cold tolerant of all of them. And I show you an example here. This is a large window box. If I knew I was doing this presentation, you'd see the whole window box. But this is a large window box that I did to create a barrier from people getting to things. And note in the case here, there's parsley. I love to use parsley in containers because what I also do with parsley, may I borrow it again? Okay. So in this case here, I'll use things like the parsley. And again, I had this garden tour, so I was telling people, they were looking at this, and look at this trailing parsley. And I thought, okay, I'll try and be funny. I said, it's the new trailing parsley. They get on the bus, leave, a reporter calls me the next day. Oh dear, there is no trailing parsley, my friends. So what I do here is actually, instead of planting the parsley up like this, I actually plant it on its side. And what happens, it starts to grow out, and gravity pulls it down. And then you get this trailing 16 to 18 inches of parsley. Okay, move over potato vine. Parsley is here. And what's parsley very important for? It's a great nutrient source for you. Oh, look, there's curly. There we go. It's so important for you. Wonderful nutritional values. Yeah, okay, what about us? But what more? What more? It looks great. It's great for floral design. But do you know it's very important for swallowtail butterflies? It is a food source for them, that whole family. And here we can use this plant to invite those guests into the garden. Thank you very much. I will not bother you again. Here's an example of a geranium. Yes, I do like geraniums, pelargoniums. I grow them for their foliage. Vancouver Centennial here. I like to combine it with things like sage, because I love that combination. I love the smell of the sage. And in this case here, I've planted it in front of our garage, which obviously I don't park the car in. But as I lift the garage door to grab my little lawnmower to cut the backyard grass, it literally takes us longer to pull the lawnmower out of the grass than to cut the grass that we have in the backyard. Having said that, oops, you get the scent of the sage as you brush up against it. Show you another one. If I was going to be stranded on a desert island and I could only take 1 or 2 plants with me, one of these would be it. And this is this one here. This is a pelargonium called Indian Dunes. Lovely for its beautiful foliage. Here you saw it earlier, here you see it. I mean, you don't need much more as it's combined with an alternanthera. But what I love about this pelargonium, look at the color it develops in the fall. How many of us can rely on pelargoniums to be giving us color from their foliage? There is a limit to that color, of course. If we get cold temperatures, frost, and nice heavy frost, eventually it's gone. But it tends to outlast most of the others. So let us keep that in mind. I'm a huge fan of coleus, a bit addicted to them. All sorts of different selections. Beautiful, the line. Gorgeous tilt-a-whirl. These are not new. They've been around for years. Do not get caught up in just what's new. We have a lot of fantastic old plants on the market. Their supply may not necessarily be there, but they're fantastic performers. This is another area I believe we have done a disservice to the industry, and a lot of wannabe gardeners have been hurt by these new introductions that are duds. They're expensive, they get to the market, they are useless in the garden, and they die, and they think they've done something wrong. Shame on us. Shame on us as an industry. That's another topic as well. Move on, Paul. I have no idea what's next. Oh, yes, this is Coleus henna. Here, I love this. Look at the ruffled foliage. Look at the underside of the leaves. That guy from Canada has lost his mind. He's looking at the undersides of leaves, absolutely. Because I love what they do here. But look at this. Look at fruit stand lemon. This is a wonderful coleus. Why do I love it? See the color echoing, the pickup, as it connects with the Siam ruby banana, alternanthera, oxalis, and in this case, a wonderful heuchera. Okay, the options and the choices. Have fun with it. Now, we have had huge problems. Again, horticulture has not learned their lesson. We have these monocultures that we do, impatience after impatience after impatience, street after street, bed after bed, year after year. And when disease comes in, there is no stopping it. Okay? Dutch elm disease, ash trees. Look at the problems that we've got when we've got entire communities planted with one species. Biodiversity is the key to move forward. Move on, Paul. What am I going to say next? Oh, yes. In this case here, I think we will see a resurgence in the world of begonias for their foliage. So in the case of some of my favorites, look at chocolate creme. It is artwork in itself. That you think that's good. Look at fireworks. You don't need much more. And then there's the beautiful Bonita Chiba with its wonderful ruffled foliage and the compound leaves. And then bring them together, and you create some wonderful, wonderful drama. One of my absolute favorites of the annuals is the Euphorbia Diamond Frost. There have been a lot of introductions of these euphorbias. Personally, I find Diamond Frost to be the superior of all of them. So there you go. I'm including a flowering plant in the presentation. Now, I'm going to talk about water and its importance later on this afternoon, if my voice holds out. But I remind us that as we are busy, how we can use containers to add a lot of color. But I'm always very conscious when I go to water my containers because they can take up a lot of water. So I incorporate a lot of succulents in my containers because they can tolerate drying out. They are not, as some people say, they are plants that don't need water. Really? They do need water, and it's important when you water them, you give them a good thorough water and then let them dry out between. This is not a large container. It's only about 12 inches across. And so in the middle of our Julys, which can be very, very hot, this thing would dry out in no time. I would be a slave to the garden to just try and keep water to these things. And this is where I incorporate a lot of succulents. Remember this planter I showed you in the spring? Well, come summer, when it gets really, really hot, I just switch it over to succulents. Okay, and this is Echeveria Doris Taylor, the fluffy Echeveria, with one of my favorite plants, Ripsalis. To me, it's the English ivy or the potato vine of the succulent world. See how it just trails down there? And here's another combination where we see using an assortment of succulents in containers. And people say, do you have to have 3 containers? Is it all odd numbers? Not always. In this case here, I did this for an event. I couldn't even afford to rent 2 of the containers, let alone rent the 3rd one, or buy them as I wanted to, so I planted into the ground. That became my 3rd element. Not always necessary. Where we put our containers, a lot of us think they're always on the edge or by the door. No, no, no. From a design standpoint, incorporate them in the garden. In this case here, the agave right in the garden. Okay? And we do that with agaves because they're not children-friendly, they're not people-friendly plants. They take DNA samples as you walk by. So be careful with them. And when we talk about water requirements and the usage, which is a hint of this afternoon's presentation, in this case here, we're using hanging baskets, which are often begging for water. Why not use plant material that can be fairly dry in hanging baskets? And I also have an issue with hanging baskets that are hanging so high up there. You know, I don't want to see made in China underneath. Bring them down. Bring them down. Okay? And this is Sedum Siboldi. All right. Come the fall, we switch over our containers. Remember the parsley, carrots, and begin to accessorize. I'm just trying to watch time here. Are we still okay for time, correct? Yes, I believe we are. Now, come the fall, often we just think about mums. And, you know, I think chrysanthemums have got a really bad rap in the industry. And in the fall, sometimes we think of mummifying the garden, if you will, because it's mums everywhere. They are good workhorses, but there are other solutions as well. Think about even some of our edibles. Chard really becomes its glory in the fall. I will often dig chard out of the vegetable garden and start moving it around because it looks so fantastic. And in this case here, incorporated in a planter. The only issue I find with growing edibles in containers, often they look so good you don't want to eat them. So it's a bit of a challenge that I have found. Show you an example here of when we design. This container here, I gave my wife heck for buying. We both like antique, we both like vintage things. I thought, why did you bring this thing home? It looks like it's been run over. And it may have been. But I immediately fell in love with this color here, this patina, this character. See how it echoes in the case of the cabbage right here? And in the case of using heucheras, coral bells, what's important when I select them, I look for coral bells that have long petioles at the base because I can then pull them through the arrangement. See how, in this case, the heuchera here, oh, I've got a pointer, smart enough. You can use there. And see the leaves right here? They're being pulled through. So we don't have to use multiple plants. I like to have fun. I like to add ornament to things. So in this case here, using the end iron of the owl. And then I like to accessorize, bringing in things like the pumpkins. And those of you that have the opportunity to grow your own pumpkins or go to a pick your own place, it's great because you can leave the pumpkins with long necks. What's the neck of a pumpkin called? No, peduncle. So we can leave that peduncle on there. And in that case, it kind of gives that Dr. Seuss effect. And I just love the drama. But I encourage you, realize the power of color. Here's an example taking a very old container. It wasn't, and when I say old, I mean it was just beat up. It wasn't like a vintage piece. A little bit of paint, see here? And I know this looks kind of odd and bizarre, but the reason this was done is because this was actually going to go by a banister on either side of a banister that would light the way. Okay, so have fun with it. And there's all things I want to tell you, but I got to move on. Okay, moving on. So I'm supposed to be done at 11:35, right? Yes, okay. All right, so I also encourage you to look beyond orange. I know it was the Pantone color, was it 2 years ago? There are lots of choices and options. Look at the selections. And I'm a bit of a hort nerd. I like to know the names of my plants. I think it's very, very important. And I remember trying to look this one up, and my son came up to me, my son Andrew, saying, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm trying to find out the name of this pumpkin." He said, "Call it Jack." And, and I said, "No, I need to find out the botanical name." "Oh, I'm going then." And as he walked away, he says, "You know, it looks like bloodshot eyes." And I thought, "Oh, pretty good." You know what it's actually called? One too many. Very, very appropriate. So Andrew and myself, one too many. I love it. Love it. So in this case, you're taking summer planters. And at the Toronto Botanical Garden, we have all sorts of events that happen sometimes very spontaneously. And someone mixed up the calendar, and instead of happening on a Thursday, the event was on a Tuesday. Well, I was going to change the planters on Wednesday. Guess what? You move very, very quickly. So we had these summer planters here that had just been kissed by a frost. Note, you know, there's a number of things that are, there are things inside here that are in the other planter. But things like the celosias, the diplodemias, ooh, they were ready for compost, worm food, which is a good thing. But in this case here, taking my favorite tool, which incidentally is not carry-on, so I could not bring it to actually show you, but this is the Japanese hori-hori knife. And it's amazing when you're doing containers because it allows you to go in and literally remove things quite quickly and just pop in things. The best gardening gift anyone can receive. So I want to show you very quickly in terms of putting together a fall container. We're going to add our height with the cupressus. We're going to add contrast. And with the red boar kale, we're going to add some color echoing with the heathers. We're going to add some euphorbias to bring that in. Let's bring in some nice texture. And this heuchera was going to echo the door. Then we're going to bring in more texture with the fine asparagus fern and then the cabbage. And then bring in things like the nitrage branches and the mentola pods. My friends, when I see people adding things to containers like the mentola pods, I remind you that it needs to be a part of the container as opposed to these pieces like these little spheres like these here that are often sticking out of the container like a planet. Okay? It's not a science fair project. So get it right. Oh, my word. All right, move on. So I want to show you another thing that I'm working on. I love wood. Wood is really, really amazing. And this is a container that I fell in love with. I love the shape and the form. So I met a farmer who was cutting down a grape field. And we often use grapevines. But this is taking grape stems. They saw them off. We have some of the best wine in southern Ontario. I'm not a wine drinker. I was more interested in his wood, and he thought I was quite strange. But anyways, but in this case here, see what we've created? Creating this drama with these. And these are architecturally tied in to the container, okay, for stability. Then I wanted to keep it fairly simple, so I added a lot of green with kale that can take the cold, because this was going to last and last, and things like the ivy. And then we just accessorized it with things like pumpkins and gourds. And again, we had another event at the Toronto Botanical Garden. I needed another container, so I quickly took it to work, and just we went out. It was kind of a celebration of edibles and incorporate them into the container. I love green and white in the fall, so this is one of my favorite combinations. I want to show you another trick that I've learned with cabbage and kale. I don't like things to all be the same. None of us are the same. And when you go to the garden center, you know, we've put pressures to have everything the same. So all of the cabbage, tube, tube, tube. They look like they've been stamped out. Oh my gosh, it's so predictable. So something I've learned to do with cabbage and kale, but I do it more with cabbage, is, and this is a very kind of a scary part of the presentation, so I apologize. I didn't have a lot of time to warn you. But what I do in the end of July, early August, is go to some of the cabbage and the kale that I'm growing, and I scoop out the centers. Okay? You can blanch that and eat it, but what you do is you scoop that out. And we all know from our horticultural classes that there are buds at the base of all of those leaves. And so we've removed the apical dominance. See, that did come, it comes into use sometimes, those lessons that we learn. They do come into use. We remove the apical dominance, and what happens is they begin to branch. Okay? And you end up with this wonderful rosette. Instead of one large, you get this wonderful rosette. And I discovered this years ago when I just graduated. I had a school loan. I was in the garden center, and my boss was saying, you cannot, we need to have every plant make it to the market. Well, I fell in the cabbage, where we were growing cabbage and kale, and I crushed a few of them. And I was scared that they would find out. So, you know, I hid them in the back, that kind of stuff, and they started to come back. And they were quite different, but really a lot of fun. And this is what you end up getting. So isn't that fun? You get these wonderful rosettes. Let's talk briefly, very briefly, and I apologize. This is quite a long talk, but I want to keep it on time to be respectful of all the other presenters. So I've got exactly 10 minutes. Holy smokes. A lot of people tell me when they do containers, they're very fearful of them breaking. Well, very important, they must have drainage holes and get them lifted off of the ground. Just a little bit so you get that air circulation. Very key. If you're scared of your container breaking, just put a smaller pot inside, whether it be a plastic pot or a fiber pot, which is going to do the thawing and the freezing. So you're alleviating the pressure on things like the iron. And in this case, what do I do? This is the exception to the rule. I will either use sand, or now, because of all this whole sustainability thing, and which is very, very key and very important, in my own home garden, my garden is 5 feet of sand. It's brutal. So I'm always, you know, I know the secret of adding organic matter, so why would I use in my container sand, which I then just add to more sand? So now what I do when I do winter arrangements, and I recommend this with my clients as well, is I use composted manure. In my pots? Yeah, but it's going to smell. How's it going to smell that late in the season? And so what I use composted manure so that come the spring, when I take apart my winter arrangement, I can then take that composted manure and just add it to the garden as soil amendment. I wish I had 10,000 pots to add, because I don't think you can ever add too much. Some of my favorite greens, I love beautiful white pine for its fragrance. I love BC cedar. I love the southern magnolia for its dark underside and rich green upper side, and beautiful fur with its dark green and silver underside. So one of my criticisms when people do winter arrangements is they're too sparse. Make them full. So this is just using 3 different types of greens, and then we accessorize, and we add a bunch of things. And those are all those different dried pods, etc. Some people like to bling it up, you know, sparkly balls and all that kind of fun stuff, to each his own. I prefer kind of the natural look to things. So I want to show you an example. This was a client I went to design for a friend of mine who owns a florist shop. And I was just having a really rough couple of weeks at work, so I volunteered at the floral shop, and she sent me out to do some containers. Therapy. And this customer, I knew immediately. I didn't even park the car. She was already out beside the car. And I thought, oh, this is not going to end so well. And everything I pulled out of the car, what is that? And how's that going to be used? And she reminded me that the importance of doing this container is because her neighbors kept watching her. Personally, I think it was the other way around. She was watching the neighbors, but we'll move on. So what I realized is she says, make sure it's not too big. So what I did was I used the dogwood, or sorry, this is a flame willow, to create my frame. Because I know I cannot go any bigger than that, because this lady will haunt me. Okay, so I used that to create my frame, added some white pine, and then accessorized it. And in this case here, I pulled on the colors of the brick, and the color of the stone, and the color of the trim. She was very pleased. She still didn't leave me, and I turned around and I said, you know, you do have 2 containers right there. So what turned out as a $150 job ended up approaching more than almost a $500 job, because she let me do these 2 containers, and then she invited me into the backyard. I was a bit scared initially, but it was to do a container. So I show you very quickly, when you're pressed for time like I am, you know, you can design and be creative, but sometimes you don't have that time. Again, the Toronto Botanical Garden. I ordered these junipers 3 months in advance. Look what came. So out of scale with the container. So we heard a chainsaw. We're a non-for-profit. The Toronto Botanical Garden is one of the only non-for-profit botanical gardens in all of North America. So we get very, very creative with this budget thing. So Sandra and I, our head gardener, we heard a chainsaw. Follow the chainsaw. They were cutting down some limbs. We took some wonderful limbs, in this case here of linden, just to create some height. And then when you're really pressed for time, I'm going to show you the clumping technique. When you really, I had to do 3 of these in 45 minutes. So you move. So in this case here, we take things like our Douglas fir, we bring in our silver fir, we bring in the, I have to get closer because I can't see with these bifocals. In this case here, we've got the white pine, we've got BC cedar, we've got Oregonia, we've got juniper berries, we bring in the magnolia, we bring in the ilex, and we bring in the strobus cones, and we are done. And that is fast. You move, move, move. And if you're in the business of doing these for clients, those of you that have landscape maintenance business, those of you that have garden centers, for us, before I left the garden center, this was our fastest growing area. These winter arrangements. People come and buy the supplies, or we have them pre-done for you. And these are not inexpensive items. I leave you with one very last example as I wrap up. This was a home that was being used. It was a tour to help raise money for cancer research. And I'm sure all of us have been touched, know someone or in our families or our friends that have been touched with this horrible disease. We're currently dealing it with my father right now, and knock on wood, we have an incredible medical system up in Canada, and he's got incredible treatment. But when they asked me if I would help to support this, of course, it was a no-brainer. Question is, I didn't have the time, but you make it happen. So to start this off, this is what we started off with. So I love the color of the brick. I love the silver. I love the patina in here. So in this case here, see how we're echoing with things like the fir, the underside? I'm not using the green side. I'm flipping it upside down and using the silver underside. Okay? Using things like the magnolia to echo the brick there. Bringing in an inexpensive Blue Haven juniper. Very inexpensive. And in this case here, we put the tree in there, and then you dress around at the base. You skirt it. And this way you can do them very, very quickly, as opposed to trying to build the whole thing. So in this case here, see how it echoes and picks up? I apologize about the color of this picture, but it picks up on some of the plants in the landscape, which is kind of the point I was mentioning earlier. It needs to be a part of the design. And then the landscapers, we had just missed them. And they had come down and done the wonderful cut things to the ground. So all the beautiful cone flowers with all the beautiful seed heads were all cut down to the ground because they're brown and they're dead. And I said, well, what about the birds? You know, they'll come in and feed on those. Birds? And I'm like, yes, you know, they're part of the landscape. Anyways, moving on. So we had, fortunately, had a bunch of these sticks that we could use. And inviting guests into the garden is so important. It is an opportunity for us to support biodiversity. So I want to show you what we did here. We created faux shrubs. Okay, so we just took the dogwood stems and drove them into the ground, and the husband comes home. It's like, I don't even remember them planting those. And I thought, no, buddy, they didn't. And there were more of those. Okay, and then so the people loved it so much we echoed it in the backyard because the people were going to go from the front of the house through the house and into the backyard. So we repeated this, and in this case here, this was one of those landscape stone places. You know, they planted boxwood in a perfect square in a little tiny footprint. I thought, can you imagine how hot that boxwood gets in July? Are we thinking about that? All that radiating heat. I felt sorry for the boxwood, but I had a job to do. So in this case here, we celebrated the vertical. See the element there? Repeating. And this is where you can take, again, instead of just doing 2 containers for the front door, build on it. Okay? Show how much you know. Show that opportunity. Really do the landscape. And in this case here, we echoed and we repeated. The owner insisted that I use birch, and I'm not sure about down here. Is birch used in your winter arrangements? It's kind of overdone in Toronto. I personally don't know how to use it, and she was so pleased with all the birch that she bought. This is how I used it. I stacked it in a corner and put on a slight angle, and then put some by the fireplace. But anyway, she was okay with that. But if that wasn't enough, and as I get down to my very last minute, you know, we're talking about using containers. And I told you to celebrate the seasons. This is the opportunity for you. Celebrate spring, summer, fall, winter. Talking about gardening all year long. And if that wasn't enough, what about gardening 24/7? So that's the container talk in a nutshell. I think I kept it on time. Thank you very much.